everybody is at a kind of aza or constellation awake. And it's time for the Maghrib prayer, and all the people say, oh, it has to be Mawlana Jalaluddin. And Rumi declines, and it's very interesting to see what he says. According to Aflaki, he says, Ma mardomi abdalim beharja'i ke bashad minashinim vemikhizim. We are the Abdal. Wherever we are, we sit or we rise. One of his characteristic, enigmatic statements, but he's saying he doesn't want to lead the prayer. So he indicates instead that Sadruddin Qunawi should lead the ulama in prayer at this event. And he says, Imamatira erbabi tasawwuf wa tamakkun la yaghand. He is one of the people of tasawwuf and tamakkun. And the dignity of leading the prayer at such an event should be with such a person. And quite often, in fact, we find this bifurcation in the memory of the people of Konya at the time. That Rumi is not a Sufi. He's one of the Abdal. If you're going to understand him and understand his poetry and the impact that he has on the later Islamic world, and indeed on people who are reading him now, including thousands of New Age followers in the West, you have to understand what it means for Rumi not to be a Sufi. What these people are saying is that a Sufi is somebody who is engaged in complex, systematic metaphysics. That's what the ulama of Konya would understand tasawwuf to be. So Qunawi, absolutely that. He takes the often virtually incomprehensible, enormous weight of Ibn Arabi's teachings, and he kind of makes it comprehensible, makes it into a system. And probably but for Qunawi and the work that he did here, not many people in the later Ummah would have heard of Ibn Arabi, because it's really hard to understand, and you turn a page and you get the exact opposite of the thing that he said on the page before, and sometimes that's deliberate. It's very hard, heavy going. Qunawi turns it into a system, particularly the tradition of the Fusus, which, as I've said, becomes axiomatic, and it's like the intellectual spine of the Ottoman ulama system, and also in the Mughal Empire and further east. Qunawi is the one who's doing that. So he's a Sufi, but Rumi is in this world, and Rumi describes himself as Abdal, ma mardume Abdalim. What in 13th, 14th century would the Abdal have been? Well, it's obviously derived ultimately from those hadiths, which are sound hadiths, which indicate that there will be a class of awliya who are Abdal, that is, the substitutionary saints, often regarded as being 40. And it's always a constant number. If one of them dies, another is, as it were, appointed to the vacancy, and most of them are hidden, and it's through their dua that creation is sustained. And this is a standard feature of traditional Sufi hagiology. But that doesn't seem to be what Mevlana is implying here. The Abdal in that world of Seljuk Anatolia seems to have meant something a bit different. There were a lot of people wandering around, usually mendicants, calling themselves Abdal, and even Europeans who travel in this region at the time, mostly Italians, remark on the strange individuals with odd behavior, revered by the masses and the peasantry in particular, being known as the Abdal. What it seems to mean is somebody whose access to the divine is not mediated by years of very elaborate study of metaphysics, and whose articulation of his system is ecstatic and impressionistic rather than rigorous. Certainly, if you look at Qunawi's work and Rumi's work and you put them side by side, it's like they're from different universes. Qunawi is extremely precise, difficult, demanding. In his tafsir in particular, everything is rigorously worked out from first principles, and he arm wrestles you into the conclusion. Rumi does none of that. He's not really interested in these aqliyat, these intellectual sciences. He's interested in the path of love, rah-e ashq. He is not linear, he is, as it were, circular, and the circle is the symbol of love. In our civilization, it's the moving beyond, the stripping away of any earthly thing like intellectuality even. Once you're in the Hajj or the Mi'raj, there's circles, there's spheres, aflaq. It represents the path of love, of ecstasy, and the turning that the dervishes do, usually for the tourists, is a kind of reflection of that, even though in the Mevlevi tradition, particularly at the beginning, it was a very impromptu thing rather than the ceremonial thing that it became later on. So if we're going to understand Rumi in that world, and obviously the ulama really revere and love him because they're all saying, you're the one who should lead the prayer at this official function. He's declining because he doesn't really feel that he is from that world. He is not from the world of institutional religion, either of highfalutin Sufi metaphysics, that seeks to get, in Ibn Arabi's tradition, into the very heart of the Qur'an rather than the surface of the Qur'an. Neither is he from the world of Sirajuddin Urmawi, where everything is worked out by logical principles that are ultimately Aristotelian and are there originally to refute Mu'tazila and others. Instead, he's from a different kind of universe, which is this universe of love. And when we talk about some of the other people that he encountered, we'll see how significant that is. But still, Sadruddin Qunawi, just because he's engaged in these extremely intricate reflections on Allah's book and writing these meticulously crafted commentaries on Ibn Arabi's most difficult cruxes of metaphysics, shouldn't allow us to be distracted from the fact that all of these people were exoteric scholars. And in fact, Sadruddin, we call him Sadruddin Qunawi, but it seems that the most common title for him at the time was Malik al-Muhaddithin. So if you look at Aflaki, who's mainly interested in Rumi's tradition, the Arifin, basically the Mevlevi tradition, you'll see that what he's really doing, his daytime job, as it were, is his hadith classes. He is the greatest hadith scholar of Konya of the day, and that is how he's generally known. So you have these three different human types. You have the Qadi, the Mutakallim, who is Sirajuddin Urmawi, the man of Aql. Islam, to be defended, has to be defended through the absolutely strongest interpretation that reason can supply. And then you have Sadruddin Qunawi, who says, actually the source and the wellspring of knowledge in Islam is the Qur'an, which is Ibn Arabi's insight, and that everything should come from opening one's heart to the isharat, the inner meanings of the Qur'an, using quite literal Zahiri method that Ibn Arabi appropriates. But still, rigorously put together, systematic theosophy, if you like. And then Rumi, his type of religion is really different as well. But what's bringing them together is the fact that they're all part of the orthodox class of ulama, because Rumi has been giving the khutbahs at the Ala ad-Deen mosque, the main mosque in Konya, and he has the white turban of the scholar. He's also an expert in hadith, mutabahir, really learned in the intellectual disciplines of his time. They're all from the class of ulama. So any idea that we have that these are kind of dusty, weird guys with funny headgear sort of disrupting what the ulama take to be the reality of Islam, it's not like that. These are people for whom the inward life and the outward life are complementary, but it's not always the same kind of complementarity. Sirajuddin Urmawi is mainly a person of Zahir, but is a great lover and respecter of the Sufis, as we see from the Manaqib al-Arifin. Sadruddin Qunawi and Rumi, the funny thing about them, even though they're almost exact contemporaries, they're both born in the same year, 1207. Rumi dies in 1273, and Qunawi dies in 1274, so that's a pretty close fit, and they're in the same city. But neither of them in any of their books, as far as I know, refer to each other. Strange. So they were on different voltages. They had respect, no doubt, and Aflaki brings that out. Aflaki, of course, is trying to magnify the greatness of Mawlana. He's writing hagiography a century later, and he often brings them together in these various set-piece encounters. But still, it is interesting that in this town, where people are coming together, sometimes they don't have much choice, they've all been invited to a banquet at the palace, they all know each other, they're part of this group of ulama, that Qurnawi and Rumi never seem to talk about each other in their books. And that, again, has to be left as a kind of mystery, but perhaps not quite a mystery, because they do have different paths. So when Rumi, as he often does in his poetry, says, put down the text of theology and pick up the flagon of love, the kind of trope that he uses frequently. Or, by the time intellect has saddled its camel for the Hajj, love has already circled the Kaaba. He says the real way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is through the heart, through love, through affectivity. That's, for him, the prophetic way. That's the way of Habibullah alayhi salam, not logic or all of this other stuff or profound meditations on different layers in Allah's book. It's love, spontaneity. For Rumi, that's what religion is about. And perhaps that's one reason why in our generation, certainly in the West, Rumi is the one who's been tweezed out of this extraordinary constellation of brilliant minds in Konya, and he's the one who the New Age people like, because everybody likes to think that they know about love. And everybody likes to use love as an excuse not to perform certain duties, or as an excuse not to read too many complex books of theology. It's an attractive excuse. But this is not really what's going on with these people. Rumi is not saying that the path of the mind, that's Urmawi's path, or the path of systematic Sufi metaphysics, which is the way of the Sufis, like Sadr ad-Din, are wrong. Instead, he's saying, that's not my way, and I am something else. Now, what was this something else? How does he become? He's clearly within the class of ulama. He's not a controversial figure, even though he says things that sometimes seem outrageous. Nowadays, if you said half of the things that he says in his diwan, you'd be chucked out of your average masjid. But that doesn't happen with the Qadi and the great scholars of the day, because they hear him. But what makes Rumi is an encounter with a remarkable man who is the fourth of the many people one could talk about. In fact, I haven't mentioned Fakhruddin Iraqi, who is living in the same house as Sadruddin Qurnawi, along with a number of other quite extraordinary people, Mu'ayyad-ud-Din Jandi, huge names, particularly in the evolution of Persian literature. Fakhruddin Iraqi, through his Lama'at and other texts, conveys the essence, as he takes it, of Ibn Arabi's system, mediated in large measure through the lens of Qurnawi to the Persian-speaking world. And from the Persian-speaking world, it spreads very quickly to the Indian world and becomes famous controversies at the time of Akbar and Aurangzeb. All of that comes from what's happening in the house that Qurnawi and Jandi and Farghani are sharing in a suburb of Konya. But none of these people have that effect on Rumi. So Rumi has left his own town, Balkh, at the age of 12. And they end up here, which they hoped was a safe distance from the marauding Buddhist terrorists of the Mongols. And the Seljuks were kind of tough warriors, Turks, soldiers, spent much of their time on horseback, pulling impossibly stiff bows. They were tough guys, the Seljuks. After all, these are the people who've defeated the Byzantines. So if you're a peripatetic scholar, you kind of figure out that a place like Konya is pretty safe, because this guy, the Paravane, Sultan Ala-ad-Din Kayqubad, these are people who are not pussycats. They're going to put up a fight. Rumi is here and is an exoteric scholar and teaches hadith and teaches kalam, and he knows that, and he is really, again, mutabahir. and is respected on that level by these great people here in Konya, and has many students of his own. And as we'll see later on, it's because of what happens between Rumi and Shams that the students, why does he have students already? And why do they love him so much? Because of what he was before. And before Shams turns up, he is in the hands spiritually of another strange, mysterious person called Burhan ad-Din Muhaqiq Tirmidhi. Now, as Tirmidhi, his name suggests, he's also from what's now Uzbekistan. He's from the east, but he's a more enigmatic Sufi type, a wanderer. But the key moment in Rumi's career is when he moves from Tirmidhi's tutelage into this very strange relationship that he has with Shamsi Tabriz. Now again, the tourist guides here will tell you, the Ministry of Tourism will sometimes tell you, any New Age guff about the religion of love will tell you that what Shams is an antinomian figure. That's the kind of standard narrative, and even some of the Orientalists like Nicholson have adopted this view. That Rumi is this orthodox doctor of the law doing incredibly boring things with the divine attributes, and then Shams comes along as a kind of hippie with a flower straight from Woodstock, and immediately they will start rocking and rolling, and that's why we Westerners like Rumi. Hold on here, because we actually know what Shams was about, because we have his book, Maghalat, which has been studied by a number of Western scholars recently, and which is an amazing powerhouse, visionary text, which shows that actually this guy wasn't a hippie, antinomian, kind of Sharia-light dervish, but in fact was a good deal more serious than that. And it's very unlikely that somebody as orthodox and straight as Rumi in this orthodox, straight Sunni city like Konya could have been immediately sort of waylaid into a New Age cult. That really doesn't happen. These people are disciplined and trained to recognize truth from error. So who was Shamsi Tabriz? And incidentally, the adab, if you're in Konya, is to visit first of all the maqam of Shamsi Tabriz. Probably not really buried there, but there's a tomb for him in Khoy, which is over the border in Iran, on the road to Tabriz. We don't really know where he is. And then you go to visit Mevlana. Shams is bringing in not the style of Khurasan, but the style of Tabriz. And again, to understand how Islam is moving at that time, you have to think about that part of the world that nowadays we don't think much about, which is basically Azerbaijan and the area down to Lake Urmia. Sirajuddin Urmawi is also from there. Shams is the other great figure from that area who's turning up. And that area is very important in terms of tasawwuf. So Tabriz is the city where Imam al-Ghazali's brother, Ahmad Ghazali, fetched up. Much more poetic, ecstatic type of person. It's the city of Abu Najib as-Suhrawardi, one of the authors of the great texts of Sunni tasawwuf. It's the city for a while of Hazrat Najmuddin Kubra. He's in Tabriz. It's said that at the time of Shamsi's youth there were 70 awliya, zahirin, manifest saints in the city of Tabriz. So it's an incredible place. And behind it you have the mountains of the Caucasus, where all kinds of extraordinary people are there studying, going into retreat. The Khalwatis basically are coming from the Caucasus. Ibrahim Gulshani a little bit later, who kind of set Cairo on fire in the early 16th century, very controversial figure with his amazing diwan, is from what's now Nagorno-Karabakh, which is in those mountainous areas just north of Tabriz. It's really a lively, living place, and it's very ancient in Islam. Just a month ago in Cambridge, we had a delegation of ulama from Azerbaijan. They have a madrasa there, and they say, whenever people visit us, they say, how long have you been Muslims? And they say, actually, it was Umar ibn al-Khattab who converted us to Islam, so we've been Muslim for a long time. And it's still a very deep place, and these traditions, alhamdulillah, are surfacing after the sort of dead years of communist suffocation. But